The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Cruiser Max Vibrance, High Stick NT, and the Manitoba Pulse Growers.
RealAgriculture.com is here with Dr. Rob Gulden. We are talking volunteer canola in soybeans, why it matters to remove these plants, how we need to do that. Tell us about the project you're working on.
Okay, we're working on a project of looking at volunteer canola and soybean. A couple of questions that we're addressing initially, which is the big one, is does it matter? First of all, we often see soybean in the field with a few volunteer canola plants sticking up above the soybean canopy. They're not pretty. They certainly can be a bit of an eyesore. But the question to the weed scientist always is, well, are they an eyesore or do they really matter? And to address that question, we've got a graduate student working on a project where we're looking at economic thresholds of volunteer canola in soybean across southern Manitoba. We have 3 sites. He did the study last year, and he's doing it again this year. And basically what we're doing there is looking at the amount of yield loss in soybean with increasing densities of volunteer canola in that soybean. That information will generate mathematical equations that then can be used to generate economic thresholds. It tells us how competitive even low densities of canola are, and as I said, we'll be able to calculate economic thresholds for volunteer canola in soybean. For farmers that might be interested what that information looks like, our Guide to Crop Protection has tables at the front that illustrate the economic thresholds or yield loss related to wild oats in cereals, as well as green foxtail in cereals, and that's exactly the information that we're generating here. After 1 year, it turns out, at least at 2 of the 3 sites, we find that volunteer canola is actually quite capable of competing with soybean, and it doesn't take very high densities to see a reduction in yield. But the strength in this type of experiment is many site years, because there's obviously a lot of different factors that affect volunteer canola populations in soybean, and so it's very difficult to say what that economic threshold is at this time, but certainly we are seeing yield losses of pretty low densities, or rather low densities, of volunteer canola in soybean, suggesting that canola is quite competitive with soybean. Shouldn't be terribly surprising. Canola obviously grows very, very quickly early in the season. Soybean tends to grow a little slower in the season, so in terms of competition, canola tends to gain the upper hand very quickly, which is obviously why it often overtowers the soybean in the plots or in those fields. And if the weed is taller than the crop, then chances are there's going to be a bit of yield loss, or the likeliness of yield loss associated with that is greater. And so we are finding some yield losses associated with volunteer canola and soybean. So the first part of the project was the developing the threshold. So that's just volunteer canola competing with soybean. We've got a second part of the project that looks at reducing. One of the big problems with volunteer canola is that not only do we have really high harvest losses in canola during harvest, much higher than other crops, and of course it's a small seeded species, so even small harvest losses usually means a lot of seeds per meter squared and high seed bank additions. But canola also has the ability to develop a dormancy in the seed bank under warm, slightly moist conditions, and so it tends to persist in the seed bank longer than most other volunteer crops. So in Western Canada, we have evidence that a single cohort will persist at least 3-4 years, and there's some anecdotal evidence that it's even longer than that if they're allowed to reseed. So the other part of the project that we're interested in is because of the herbicide tolerance or herbicide resistance issue in volunteer canola, making it difficult to control with single modes of action in soybean. We're also studying or looking at reducing the seed bank of volunteer canola the year before producers grow soybean. So we're making the assumption, well, we're testing both. We're testing various tillage methods in the fall, if we can use those to reduce seed bank persistence. And we're also looking at different cultural and chemical methods and different crop scenarios that where we try to reduce, number one, emergence of volunteer canola the next year, but also then seed return of volunteers that emerged in a series of different crops. And those crops include cereals, and we're looking at in part different row spacing, maybe different densities, different types of cereals, more competitive ones versus less competitive ones. And we're also going to look at soybean directly in that we're growing soybean right after a canola crop with the worst case scenario on the seed bank, and looking at different methods and ways to reduce volunteer pressure in the soybeans. And then in the future, we'll be looking at herbicide control as well. That'll be research that'll be started next year. This year, we're just sticking with those. So seed bank management before the soybean crop is planted, I think, is going to be critical in reducing the populations of volunteer canola in the soybean, as well as seed return by volunteers the year before the soybean crop. And so that's a second important part of the project that we've got a grad student just starting out on.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much.
Sweet.